Ever hear anyone make the claim that white people are indigenous to Africa, or that the first man would have been a white man? Yeah, I know, YouTube's filled to the brim with ignorant and uneducated people saying just that sort of stupidity. Well, it's time to give these suckers some black truth, and you better believe it's gonna hurt. But first, we have to go back to the beginning, and that means going back to Africa. Africa is where all human life began. Eurocentrics had insisted for hundreds of years that Europe was the cradle of humanity, and when that lie predictably fell apart, they switched it to Asia. Like all Eurocentric claims, there wasn't a single shred of evidence to back up this idiocy, but it made whites feel good, and that was all that mattered. Until 1987, when Dr. Rebecca Kahn wrote a stunning article for the magazine Nature. Well, it was stunning for the Eurocentrics, because in it she declared that mitochondrial DNA made it clear that all humans can be traced back to Africa, with a woman who lived about 200,000 years ago in the area of Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania. Though some scholars already knew this.
We are able to say scientifically today, to say with certainty that mankind was born in Africa, on the latitude more or less of Kenya, and that area which comprises Kenya, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. It is in this region, that is this region in Kenya, where we find all of the most ancient evolutionary information. Nature created 6 specimens of man before we got to man as we know him today. All fossils that have been found outside of Africa have been found under close analysis to be much more recent than those found in Africa. And no other continent in the world has the complete series of fossils indicating the 6 specimens that I spoke of before. Nature doesn't do anything by chance, and it's for that reason that humanity, mankind that was born in a sub-equatorial region, was given melanin to protect its skin, and it's for that reason that it is clear, it is certain that first man had to be a black man.
Remember, at the time humanity arose 250,000 years ago, the Earth was still going through the last ice age. Europe was far colder than anything people can imagine today. And for a warm-blooded creature like man to have begun and survived during an ice age, he would have had to have originated in the hottest region on the planet. There's simply no other way. Even racists like Dr. James Watson, the Nobel Prize-winning geneticist who discovered the DNA double helix, had to admit man came from Africa in his book, DNA, The Secret of Life.
Why was it not possible for mankind to have been born in many parts of the earth?
That theory has made a certain amount of sense. Not that it made good sense, but it made a certain amount of sense. It would explain that there are different peoples in different parts of the world with different characteristics. Nature never strikes twice in its evolution. It doesn't ever hit the same place 2 times. In the animal kingdom, you can see that throughout the evolution of animals, a being was created, and it either disappeared or changed somewhat, or a new being completely was created, but never the same being twice. And to remain strictly scientific, it doesn't make common sense to say that man was created twice.
So science had now answered where life began, and with whom. In Africa, with a black woman. So these 2 characters are just another example of Eurocentrics pretending to be something they're not in order to feel good about themselves. Kind of like these guys. Anthropologists say when these first people, these blacks, left the cradle of humanity, they almost all went northward. The primary branch of this migration moved into what is today Kenya, and then north into modern Ethiopia, and finally to the north of the continent, into what would become Kemet. This is what modern science says, and the ancient Egyptians agree. In the Hennifer Papyrus, the Egyptians declared that they came from where the Nile River begins, at the foothills of the Mountains of the Moon, where God Hapi dwells. We have two geographical identifiers here, mountains, plural, and the origin of the Nile. We'll do this carefully so the Euro clowns don't get lost. The Nile River is the only river on Earth that flows from south to north instead of north to south. It has two branches, the Blue Nile in the east, which originates in Ethiopia, and the White Nile, which originates in the area around Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. So, no matter which branch you choose, there's no denying that we are deep within Africa, where even the most delusional Euro clown wouldn't dare say white people might have come from. The Blue Nile cannot be what the Hennifer Papyrus was referencing, because its reservoir, Lake Tana, is so tiny, and there are no mountains there anyway. So it can't meet both of our requirements, without which it can't be the right answer. That only leaves the White Nile. Already we can see it's in a very promising and familiar neighborhood, the Great Lakes region of Central Africa, where man arose. It's also the location of the Ruwenzori Mountains. These are the foothills of the Ruwenzori Mountains in the foreground, and in the background you see the Ruwenzori Mountains themselves. The priest Hunefer described them accurately. Keep in mind, this is over 4,000 miles into the African interior. Small wonder the Egyptians were so proud of themselves. They felt they could accurately trace their roots back to the very dawn of humankind. Science has certainly confirmed this. Another bit of Euroclown stupidity, they keep talking about Africans as Hamites, and others talk about non-Negro Hamites. They have no idea what they're even talking about. They claim to base this on the Bible, but the Bible doesn't support any Hamite nonsense. The way the Euroclowns tell the story, Ham was the son of Noah, whom Noah cursed, saying his descendants would be the servants to the children of Ham's brothers. The Euroclowns seized upon this fable and tried to use it to promote the idea that slavery and colonialism were simply the fulfillment of divine prophecy. Only one small problem. The Hamite curse isn't in the Bible. Genesis 9:25, and he, Noah, said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be unto his brethren." Canaan! It doesn't say a word about Ham, and there is no version of the Bible where it reads Ham instead of Canaan. So, why isn't it called the Canaanite curse? Because Canaan, according to the Bible, was the progenitor of the Phoenicians. The Phoenician contributions to all of white civilization has been so vast that whites absolutely had to portray them as white European people, even if doing so thoroughly contradicted their precious Hamite curse. So yet again the Euroclowns have proven themselves to be liars. But for the sake of argument, let's say that God got confused with Noah's order and decided to curse all of Ham's sons just to make sure he got the right one. Anyway, Ham had 3 other sons, Mizraim, Put, and Cush. Mizraim allegedly gave rise to the Egyptians, white of course, and Put gave rise to the rest of the light-skinned North Africans, even though that was kind of redundant. So, that leaves us with Cush, who was Ham's firstborn son. One has to wonder why Noah didn't curse Ham directly, or his firstborn. Ham, who the Euroclowns insist was a white man, was supposed to be the ancestor of all blacks. They never explain exactly how that worked. In fact, they're not even sure if Ham's first son, Cush, was white or black. All they know is Cush was the father of the black ethnic groups, which kinda contradicts Ham being the father of all blacks, now doesn't it? Which means even if you believe Ham was cursed, the term Hamite still has no meaning. To further complicate matters, the Euroclowns aren't even clear on which of Cush's sons were Negro as opposed to being black-skinned white people. You know, Hamites. Or why only one of Ham's children became black and not the other 3. Or what the difference is between a Hamite and a Negro anyway. So the term Hamite means nothing, and we can now see the Bible has been turned into a tool of white supremacy. But the Eurocentric cult wasn't done yet. In what amounts to a last gasp, they are now saying that even if Egypt was black, it was nothing compared to Greece, which, they say, was lily white. We'll see about that. are the Greeks. More than men. They were manly men, fierce in battle, philosophers and profound thinkers. They were the foundation of the white world. And for the Euro clowns, that means the Greeks have to, absolutely must be, white people. From the highest ranking member of the Forum to the lowliest slave. Not only that, but every bit of their culture had to come from them, with no outside influence, and certainly nothing from the black world, even though Africa was far closer to them than Europe. Yes, sir, Greece was the quintessential white civilization, with strong, smart white people as far as the eye can see, and not a person of color for 1,000 miles. In fact, the Greeks hated non-whites, and made no bones about it.
This is Sparta!
Small wonder the Euro clowns love Greece so much.
Go tell the Spartans, passerby, that here, by Spartan law, we lie.
And lie they did. Lied their asses off. For starters, Greece was the world's first multiracial society. And second, there is no connection between Greece and the Northern Europeans who never get tired of bragging about them. But before we get to how black Greece was, let's address this whole macho Greek myth. Everybody knows that Greece was pretty much known for only two things, philosophy and homosexuality. And not just among men. Remember, the word lesbian comes from the Greeks, the term being coined after the Greek island of Lesbos, made famous by the ancient Greek poetess Sappho, who apparently couldn't keep her mind or her hands off of other women. The Greek reputation for homosexuality even made it into pop references for sex, such as anal sex being referred to as doing it Greek style. Up until now, Greek men have been stereotyped by Western civilization as dainty, physically weak, and womanly. All that changed in the last few years. The United States entertainment industry decided to help butch up the Greeks' image with movies portraying the Greeks as tough guys. Even video games got in on the fun. First came Troy, which tried to make Achilles cool by reinventing him as some sort of badass straight out of the Matrix.
Immortality! Take it! It's yours!
The script seemed to be a paint-by-numbers attempt at making an epic. Lousy dialogue, pretty actors who can't act, lots of fake blood, and characters as flat as cardboard. But Tinseltown was just getting started. Next came Alexander. Oliver Stone wrote better dialogue than Troy, but he was so obsessed with incest, lust, homosexuality, and murder, he forgot about the movie. If he had really wanted to be bold, he would have told his audiences the truth, that most of Alexander's legend is a complete fraud. That he didn't conquer the world. At best, all he conquered was the Mediterranean and select portions of Western Asia. But Oliver Stone is a white man, and the fictional Greece whites have created in their own minds proved too great a temptation for him to resist. Without a care for the facts, he repeated the age-old lie that Alexander the Fake traveled untold thousands of miles to the farthest reaches of the continent in his unstoppable quest to conquer the world. But Stone never bothered to tell his audience that Alexander never went into Africa, which was only a few hundred miles from Greece. So, why did Alexander choose to travel thousands of miles across Asia into the middle of nowhere as opposed to going into Africa, which was only a hop, skip, and a jump away? After the defeat of Darius III, the Persians ceded their imperial holdings to old Alex, and he walked into Egypt without any opposition. Like all Greeks, he knew Nubia was where the Egyptians got their huge gold reserves. So if Alexander was so great, why didn't he simply keep marching south into Nubia and sweep the savage, primitive Negroes aside and take the land, the gold, and the glory? Because Queen Makeda of Ethiopia was waiting on him with a division-strong army of elephants, and Ethiopian soldiers, Alex decided to keep heading east in search of enemies who didn't bite back, though his northern European admirers always seemed to conveniently forget that he left the entire continent of Africa untouched. But, as ridiculous as Troy and Alexander were, nothing could prepare the world for the outrageous spectacle of 300, which became the magnum opus for white supremacists who clearly saw it for the race war analogy that it was. In that movie, the Greeks were reimagined as uber-macho dudes who not only scorned homosexuality, but frequently engaged in superhuman feats of battle. Now, the director of 300, Zack Snyder, is a Jew, so the anti-Arab slant of the film was understandable. But the anti-black slant was not. Whereas the movie Troy went to great lengths to bleach all non-whites from view, 300, on the other hand, took great pains to put blacks into the movie every chance it got, though never in a flattering light. Leonidas is shown disparaging the men of Athens as effeminate.
The Athenians have already turned you down. And if those philosophers and boy lovers...
But the Spartans engaged in rampant homosexuality just like the Athenians did. In fact, their practice was to fight naked, so as to jump on fallen enemy soldiers and, well, you can guess. Nearly everyone in the movie talks about freedom and resisting slavery. The Greeks in the movie refer to the Persian army as Xerxes' slaves and the slaves of Xerxes. But what Zack Snyder doesn't tell you is that the Greeks had slaves, the Helots, whom they routinely killed as part of their regular training, because a Spartan was required to kill at least one person before he could officially graduate from training and finally be assigned to a unit. The Helots were almost always the target of choice. The Spartans subjected the Helots to a wide variety of humiliations, such as forcing them to drink pure wine until they could barely stand. Then the Spartans brought in their children to laugh and mock the Helots. This was done in order to teach Spartans from an early age to have no respect for Helots. So the Spartans committed the same kind of atrocities the movie accuses the Persians of doing. Only the Spartans did far worse. Now, was the Greece of Troy, Alexander, and Leonidas at least majority white? Sure, and no one has ever said otherwise. Then what's wrong with this picture? I'll tell you what's wrong with it. Anytime anything in Africa is shown by the white media, they always, without exception, put white people into it, or credit it to a white civilization, regardless of whether they had anything to do with it or not. And if they can't put white people into it, then they try to denigrate it or show it as primitive or otherwise inferior. Well, Greece was multiracial, or rather biracial. Why has no one ever mentioned that? It's time to blow the lid off the lies. Herodotus claimed the Sesostris armies first colonized the Greek Isles. Others say it was a contingent of Ethiopian colonists. The Pelasgians were of African origin and inhabited Greece long before the Dorians, that is, the whites, came and displaced them. But, for the sake of argument, let's say the Dorians really were the original inhabitants of Greece. And as long as we're telling that lie, let's go ahead and say the Pelasgians were whites as well, and that the blacks who lived just over the Med were all immigrés and not native inhabitants. Just how much contact did the Greeks have with the blacks? How great was the cultural influence of Africans on the first white civilization? After the Greeks took custody of Egypt from the Persians, you'll note that the Greeks living in Africa began to call themselves pharaohs, like Ptolemy Soter did. They adopted the religious beliefs of the Africans and began to dress like the Egyptians rather than like the Greeks or Macedonians. And when these Greeks brought African culture to Rome, even the Romans couldn't resist. The Romans adopted the cult of Isis. Egyptian priests went to Rome and performed ceremonies for the Isiac cultists. Now, when in all of human history have you heard of the conquerors taking on the dress, religion, language, and customs of those they conquered? Greece didn't do this with any of the nations they ruled, except Egypt. But we see Africa's influence elsewhere, in the Greeks' literature and artwork, where the idea of a black man and a white woman was not only unremarkable, it was celebrated. We see it in the figures from everyday life, such as this man kneeling with an object, or this sculpture of an African, possibly dancing. Clearly this brother hung around that bunch of boy lovers too long. Or this African figure, believed to possibly be as old as 1000 BC. Further proof the black presence in Greece predates Alexander and Leonidas by hundreds of years. African heads were particularly favored when it came to perfume flasks and wine jars. This symbolized the Africans were associated with beauty and gaiety. By the way, where are the British or the Dutch or Germans or Spanish in the Greeks' art? Considering these same white Europeans claim to trace their heritage back to the Greeks, they ought to be everywhere. But instead, they're nowhere to be found in Greek art or literature. So much for a Greco-European connection. Moving right along, the Greeks even incorporated Africans and Africana into their mythology, such as Cepheus and his wife Cassiopeia, who were the king and queen of the mythical realm of Ethiopia. Classical scholars, that is to say white, say that the Ethiopia mentioned in Greek mythology is not the same as the physical Ethiopia in Africa, that it was a fictional place located somewhere in modern-day Palestine. Be that as it may, according to the Greeks, the people of the mythological Ethiopia were dark-skinned and woolly-haired, just like the Ethiopians in Africa. Here we see Memnon, another of the kings of Ethiopia, about to go to battle flanked by two of his fellow Ethiopian soldiers. Apparently things didn't work out for old boy because we see Eos, the goddess of the dawn, carrying him away for burial. Notice her color, pale white, and his, jet black. And here we have a sculpture of Memnon from the 2nd century AD. He's shown with short curly hair, big lips, and... hey, what happened to his nose? Sometimes the appearance of people from Ethiopia would vary, but, as we'll explain later in the video, whites have always had their hang-ups where the Ethiopians were concerned. Not to mention the Greeks admired the Ethiopians and credited much of their civilization to them, so they were not as color-conscious as the Euro clowns. Moving right along, here we see Perseus consulting King Cepheus about whether to save Andromeda or not. Notice Cepheus' skin is not black, possibly because the image on this face is done on a black background as is, but his hair is woolly and short, like a typical Ethiopian, as opposed to Perseus' long, stringy hair. And here we have an image of Perseus again, only this time he's depicted in black. Strange that his dog is shown as white, but he's not. We should also consider that the Greek artifacts we have today have passed through the hands of innumerable Eurocentrics, any one of whom could have called themselves altering these works so as to force them to conform to their own psychological needs. That is to say, so they could see the Greece they wanted to see rather than the one that actually existed. I mentioned whites having problems with Ethiopia's blackness. Allow me to offer another example based on another set of Greek writings. This time from the New Testament of the Bible. The book of Acts, 8th chapter, 26 through 30th verses reads, Now an angel of the Lord spoke to Philip, saying, Arise, and go toward the south along the road to Gaza. So he arose and went, and behold, a man of Ethiopia, a eunuch of great authority under Candace, the queen of Ethiopia. Then the Holy Spirit said unto Philip, Go near, and join thyself to this chariot. And Philip ran to him. This is the single most overlooked chapter of the entire Bible, and it's not by accident. White people hate it. This Bible chapter shows both an angel and even the Holy Spirit of God himself ordering the white boy to drop what he's doing, get up and run behind the chariot of an influential and wealthy black man. How humiliating. That is, if you believe in a racial hierarchy, which most white people do. But the Eurocentric denial of this chapter goes far beyond merely limiting any mention of it. With few exceptions, whenever white people do depictions of this little-known Bible story, they're always sure to make certain the Ethiopian is shown as a white man, even though these pictures were done in the 19th and 20th centuries, an era in which no white person can claim to think Ethiopians were white. And in the one or two cases where they don't bleach him, they at the very least make his chariot driver white. When pressed on this, whites love to reply, "Well, we're all God's children. Color doesn't matter." But let someone mention the Black Madonna, and all of a sudden those same whites will accuse you of black supremacy. And isn't it strange how none of Solomon's hundreds of wives is ever shown as black? Not even the Queen of Sheba, who the Bible says was the Queen of Ethiopia. Nor are any of the apostles shown as black. And we never see whites depicting Moses' Ethiopian wife, who is mentioned in Numbers 12. So clearly, color matters to someone. Speaking of biblical whitewashing, consider King Taharka, one of the Nubian pharaohs. He rescued Jerusalem, but not only do we see no depictions of him, white or otherwise, we don't even hear about his story, mainly because it shows the Israelites needing help, and this time it's not God who comes to the rescue. But also because the good white people who see the Bible as their personal property would have to explain how it is that the Egyptians would come to the aid of the very Hebrews whose firstborn they had allegedly killed, which means Egypt would look a little less sinister. That's the pattern, folks. Anytime anything having to do with Africa is mentioned, they absolutely must put a white person in there. And failing that, they simply don't mention it at all. They pretend as if it never happened. This is a mass mental disorder of vast proportions. In his most famous work, The Odyssey, Homer described the Ethiopians as favorites of the gods and the most just of men. As I said in part 2 of this series, modern Eurocentrics claim the location of Ethiopia was in and around modern-day Palestine. But as David Sachs writes in a dictionary of the ancient Greek world, neither Homer nor any of the other early Greek writers gave Ethiopia any sort of location. And when the Greeks did finally begin to write of where Ethiopia was, they placed it in Nubia, not Western Asia. Furthermore, Herodotus wrote the Ethiopians were the most beautiful and longest lived of the human races. Imagine that! The first time black is beautiful is expressed in recorded history, it was done by the Greeks. But hey, who are we going to believe? The ancient Greeks or the Euro clowns? Now that we've made clear the connection between Africa and Greece, let's see if we can find any connection between Greece and the Euro clowns. The Greeks had literature, philosophy, organized religion, and science thousands of years ago. In fact, Greece was where the first writing of the white world came from, starting with Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, where he frequently mentions Ethiopia, but gives no mention to the lands north of him. Let's look at the northern Europeans. What were their ancient writing systems? Oh, that's right. The northern Europeans didn't have any writing systems. Well, let's look at their architecture then. Oh, I forgot. They didn't have any architecture either, though they did have this, a pile of rocks. And they don't even know what purpose this rock pile served. Some white people say it was an ancient astronomy lab, though they still can't tell you what it was these ancient whites were allegedly looking at. Other whites say it was a meeting place for druids. Others still say it was a landing spot for UFOs. Perhaps the reason the northern Europeans are so confused about their history is because until recently, they largely didn't have one. We'll take Britain as an example. Literacy of any kind didn't come to the English people until the Romans invaded in 41 AD, but even then it wasn't the Brits doing any writing. It was the Romans, such as the Roman historian Tacitus, who reveals that the British were naked savages. To further show their disdain for the British, the Romans referred to them as Britunculi, little Britons, like calling them children. The historian Strabo described the British as war-mad and always ready for battle. Tacitus gave an account of the British ritual of human sacrifice, saying they deemed it indeed a duty to cover their altars with the blood of captives and to consult their deities through human entrails. Fighting naked, barbaric customs? Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? The Roman attempts to domesticate the English predictably ended in failure. And about 410 AD the Romans left, but even after 4 centuries of study, the English had utterly failed to educate themselves, because it would still be another 2 centuries before the Saxons, Germanic emigres from Europe who would come to Britain and manage to teach the English to write. Imagine that! There have been people in Britain for over 12,000 years, but they didn't learn how to translate their grunts into written symbols until about 650 AD. And had it not been for the Romans, who the Saxons learned Latin from, the English would still be sitting in their caves, grunting like animals and totally unable to write. They didn't have a writing system, and they weren't on the verge of making one. And for that matter, neither were the Saxons, the Russians, or any other group of Northern Europeans. The Romans literally had to come and show these people how to wear clothes and how to write their names. So, how can they claim a connection to Greece when their first contact with the outside world came with the Romans? When you have no history, you have to make one up. Now we see why they are so desperate to attach themselves to Greece. It's either that or admit that every other group of people on Earth had managed to create writing systems and architecture and forms of government and civilization except them. Now, it's a subject that deserves many books, but so far hasn't received even one, and that is that the Northern Europeans are essentially an AD people. Before Rome, these people might as well not even have existed. But to add insult to injury, the same Northern Europeans who want to claim Greece as part of their heritage didn't even consider Greeks to be white people until the 20th century. Why? Because Greeks are darker than Northern Europeans, and given their glaring proximity to Africa and their innumerable mentions of Ethiopians in their history and mythology, it was clear the Greeks had black ancestry, and science has discovered this as well. The Northern Europeans resented having been totally left out of the grand Greek story, so they decided that once they'd taken over the world, they would treat the Greeks as outcasts, until it was convenient for them to change their minds. As black scholars go about reclaiming our heritage in Egypt, expect to see more movies, TV shows, and documentaries about Rome and Greece. The Euro clowns have lost this battle, and they know it, so they're retreating to safer ground. But if they're planning to make their last stand in Greece, they might want to think twice. Because there's a reason the Greeks never called themselves Europeans, and why they showed such profound respect for the Ethiopians and the Egyptians, and why Homer and Herodotus credited so much of their civilization to Africa. Oh yes, black truth hurts. So in summation, let's make it clear to the Euro clowns what Africa contributed to the world and what the Europeans did. Ours, yours. Ours, yours. Ours, yours. Any questions?